Welcome to Roll for Crit. Jonathan here to give you my review of The Phantom, the card game. This is based on the 1930s comic The Phantom, one of the OG comic book superheroes who went on to influence a lot of modern superheroes that we still see around today. This is a card game for 1 or 2 players. So I primarily played this one solo, which is why I'm just here by myself reviewing it, but you can play it co-op if you would like. The way it works is that you have a deck of cards representing your hero, which could either be the Phantom himself, or you can play as Diana, his compadre / love interest who has her own special skills and abilities. And you're going to be progressing through a set of encounters based on a deck according to which scenario you're attempting. There are 3 included in the core set. Right now, I have the very beginning of the first one I think they kind of recommend, or one of the simpler ones to start off with. The way it works is you're going to have an entire deck which will be numbered, and you're going to move through this deck, and as you go, these cards are going to instruct you as to how to set up what's going on. So for instance, this one told me that we start with Thunder in play, our trusty horse, and it also told me how to set up this Destiny deck right here, which is going to be revealing different enemies possibly or other events that occur throughout the round. But depending on the scenario, it could be more or less complicated. There could be all sorts of things that come into play that really change things up. And you don't necessarily know what your objective is going to be ultimately to complete this until you get to the bottom of this deck. There's also going to be this scenario card here. In this case, we are recreating the story of when the Phantom met his trusty canine companion, Devil. So you're going to be encountering a lot of dangerous wolves and things like that. And once you have completed whatever this condition is, that will instruct you as to when you should look back to the deck and figure out which card to find to progress on to the next chapter. The way the basic gameplay works, you are going to have a hand of cards, of course, and each one has a different ability for you to choose to play. Now, you can either pay for them with the cost in the corner, which is in these various resources that you'll be collecting, or you can discard them in order to receive the resource imprinted in the other corner. So you're choosing whether you want to use it for its resource now to play a different card, or get rid of other cards or use the resources you already have from previous turns in order to play that card. And that's going to be the biggest decisions that you're going to have to make turn to turn, is trying to figure out the right way to utilize those cards. There's a few different types of cards. So some of them are just one-time actions that might affect various things in the game. Maybe you can switch up the Destiny deck or allow you to draw a card. There's allies like Thunder here, which stay in play, and if you exhaust them, they have an ability. Thunder will let you draw a card, for example. Or you could play items like weapons that are going to increase your attack power. And that's going to be pretty important because usually one of the things you're going to want to be doing is attacking enemies. So on your turn, you will begin usually by drawing one of these Destiny cards. In this instance, this one tells you to take an enraged wolf card that's been set aside and put it into play in this row. In this special scenario, you have this set of enraged wolf cards. Again, that's kind of a unique thing for this scenario. And this is an enemy that you might be able to attack. To attack, you have to spend one of these skull icons. Each player has a base power of 1, so they'll do 1 damage. And then you do something called a card check, which could come up in a number of different scenarios, which is when you flip the top card of your deck, and depending on the symbol there, it might have some kind of an effect. In the case of an attack, if there's more skull symbols, that adds to your damage levels. So if you had done enough to take out the enemy, then they're removed. Otherwise, they're going to stick around and they'll be attacking you. That's what you have over here is this injury deck. You have a set of different injury cards, and if there are enemies, you take an injury for each one that is left in that row. And the injuries don't have too many specific effects, but often it'll say, for instance, this shoulder injury, if you have 2 of these, your character is knocked out. So you're going to want to try to get rid of that as soon as possible or take the risk. The reason you might not want to get rid of it is because at the start of each turn, you can choose to either heal yourself or ready all of your cards. So you might really want to use some of these cards. You might have to sacrifice a turn keeping that injury and risking it because you really need to use some of these abilities for the next turn in order to succeed. There are also different difficulty levels for the scenarios. Right now here, this one is easy or normal level, but you can flip it over to the heroic or mythic level. So there's all kinds of different challenges that are in play, and you can throw things in such as this loot table. Each scenario has one. So if you do kill an enemy, then you get to do a card check and potentially receive some kind of a prize, maybe even a new card that will go into your discard pile for use right away when you draw it again. And there's also going to be an achievements card for each scenario, which will just say, oh, if you manage to do this special thing, again, you're going to be rewarded with some kind of new card to add to your deck. So as the game goes on, right here is just the size of your starter deck. But once you've played through a few scenarios, you're going to be adding a whole bunch of new cards with all kinds of different, more specialized abilities. And usually they're pretty thematic. They're directly related to the events that you experience throughout whichever scenario. So you keep playing until you figure out what the objective is and you've completed it. Sometimes it's to defeat a certain enemy or what have you. And if you didn't, you can try it again. If you did, you can still try it again if you want now with your upgraded deck, or you can move on to the other scenarios. Like I said, there are 2 different characters you can play as, and Diana actually plays pretty differently. She has her own unique resource that only she gets, this inner fire resource, and she has martial arts moves, which play in a pretty unique way. They have different skill levels, and that determines which ones you're able to play at any given time. As you can see, all of this artwork is taken right from those original comics. It's got a super pulpy, original, old school, retro comic book vibe to it. So if you are into that kind of thing, and if you are into the Phantom, I think you will definitely find a lot to like here. It seems very, so I'm speaking as someone who has almost no familiarity with the Phantom. I had seen the movie that they made sometime in the 90s, but I am in no way an aficionado of the original comic books. So for me, I was going into this pretty fresh, pretty unbiased, not having any real preconceived notions about how a Phantom game should play. That said, I think that the way that these scenarios are organized, and they're very easy to set up because the cards are numbered, so you just go right through the different cards and it walks you through every step of the way pretty easily. It is very thematic. It does something that I like in these styles of card games where it's not the same objective every time. It's not just take down the boss, get their health to 0 before your health gets down to 0. There's always going to be something different. And some of them get very different. They really try to simulate different events. Maybe you're trying to chase someone on a truck, and there are different ways of determining how far away they are from you. You've got all kinds of counters over here. These ones in particular can kind of stand in for anything depending on what the current scenario is telling you. So a lot of times you'll be adding those to cards and determining how they work that way. So it's a system that really allows for them to do a lot of different things and make it so it's going to feel very different every time you play. Even within the same scenario, sometimes there are either choices you make or just different outcomes. So it might say, if you defeat this enemy by this time, then you read card 32. But if you didn't, then you read card 32A. So it might not necessarily be a loss, but you are going to get maybe a new challenge or just branch off into a different path. So there's a good amount of replay value right there if you're interested in exploring all those different possibilities. I also really enjoyed as I said, the decision making of whether to use cards for resources or spending resources to play them for their abilities. It definitely reminds me of LCGs, if you're familiar with a lot of those, especially something like Marvel Champions or The Lord of the Rings, where it's this type of gameplay of having cards that have different effects, actions, or abilities that stay out on the field, and choosing if I'm going to spend them for their resources, as I said, or if I want to play them right now. And your deck isn't that huge, at least not at the start of the game. So you're likely going to cycle through it a few times and figure out how you want to set yourself up. And of course, you can fully deck build in this as well. Not only can you just play through the scenarios and build your deck that way with what they reward you, but also once you're finished with that, if you want to play around, they have full deck building rules where you can just kind of mix and match the cards and do it as you please. Now, there's not a ton of options here. There's just this one core set right now and an expansion coming up, which I'll mention again later on. So you can't go too crazy with the deck building, but it's an option that's there if you've played through it a bunch of times and you want to try to customize it and suit it to your specific needs, or if you think that there is a way you want to try to tackle one of these scenarios. But I do like the way it is laid out when it's your first time playing, that you get these thematic rewards. Your deck gets a little bigger each time. The scenarios increase a little bit in difficulty and complexity each time. It feels like a natural progression as you play through this story, whether you're doing it by yourself or with another player. And by the way, playing with 2 players in co-op does not change any of the rules. You just go back and forth taking turns, still activating all the different things on your turn. Crits and misses for the Phantom, the card game. Crits. The way the game's progression works, that has you working through a deck and experiencing new elements of the story and discovering new objectives, is very thematic, and it is unpredictable exactly how you're going to win or lose the first time you play, so there's always something new to discover. You'll be presented with a number of tough decisions to make during each turn, whether it's how to spend or use your cards, or whether you should heal an injury or ready some of your items that you have in play, or which enemies that are out are more important to go up against. There is a pretty tense puzzle there that you will have to contend with every single round. Misses. This is an independently designed game, and while for the most part it runs pretty smoothly, I did run into a fair number of rules ambiguities where I had to look things up or where they just weren't clearly indicated on the cards or in the rule book. And it does feel like there's overall, they could have used a little bit more polish. As I said earlier, I am not someone who has a ton of knowledge about the Phantom character. So for me, I was going into this really looking at it just purely as the game as it stands by itself. And I enjoyed it pretty well. Like I said, I think if you're familiar with some of these card games, this LCG style of game where there's a bit of a deck building element and also this story progression as you continue and get new cards for your deck, you will find something to enjoy here, I think. From what I can tell, if you are a fan of the Phantom, you'll get even more out of it because even as someone who had no knowledge of these stories, I did get a pretty good sense of exactly what was going on, and I think the way that the theme is integrated into the mechanics is pretty clever. There is an expansion for this right now called Terror in Mawitan that is on Kickstarter at the time of this recording at least, and hopefully in the future you'll be able to pick that up, which is a new adventure. And I think the game is perfectly designed for that. There's plenty of room for those additional modules that they could design and throw in, even additional characters. I don't know how many of those are viable from the Phantom universe, but it's something that they could do. Theoretically, it might even work with 3 or 4 players if they decide to go that way, but I actually liked it pretty well as a solo experience. You could also, I suppose, play it with 2 characters just by yourself if you want to get the full experience that way and you're familiar with the cards and the decks and how they work. And I did appreciate that the Phantom and Diana both play pretty differently. So there's a lot to discover here in terms of you playing through each scenario once, then you could play through them again with a new deck. You can play with Diana, a totally different character, and you can try all the different difficulty levels. There's 4 different difficulty levels. So tons of options, plus the achievements that you can check off. So you might play through the scenarios pretty quickly, but there's a lot of reasons to go back to them if you enjoyed the core gameplay. So if any of that sounded good to you, this is something you might want to take a look at. That's the Phantom, the card game, the core set, and that expansion is also floating around out there somewhere. Haven't tried it out yet, but hopefully that new adventure is also fun. Like I said, my only big issue with the game is some of the rules weren't always totally clear, especially with regards to some of the scenarios. Some of the scenarios are also a little bit, could be pretty challenging, and sometimes there's a random effect of which card you draw that could make or break, but usually the game was fast enough or that happened early on enough that it didn't bother me too much, but your mileage may vary. Let me know in the comments section what you think about the Phantom, the card game, if you've played it, or if you're a fan of the comic or the movie, what you think would make for a good addition to the series. Thank you for watching. My name is Jonathan, and this has been Roll for Crit.
It's time to say so long and farewell. Before you say goodbye, please hit that like and subscribe. It really helps us out. And if you can, support us on Patreon. If you want to spend more time with us, we go live on both Twitch and our Roll for Crit channel, Roll for Crit Live. And those are more longer form videos. There'll be links down below, and we'd love to have you join us.